There was a moment, in the early years of the Conclave's engagement with the third planet of the Yellow Star, when a Velkari junior cartographer named HFY had filed a report suggesting that the humans might not be sapient in the conventional sense. The argument was based on behavior rather than neurology. Sapient species, when introduced to a threat significantly beyond their technological capacity to address, tended to perform one of three responses: withdrawal, negotiation, or surrender. The humans, in the three documented encounters HFY had reviewed, had performed none of these. They had simply continued doing whatever they were doing, with modifications, until the threat became something they'd had experience with and could therefore manage. The report was filed, read by a handful of analysts, and ultimately stored rather than acted upon. HFY was not wrong exactly, but had misidentified the phenomenon. The humans were sapient. They were simply not built around the assumption that the current situation was the permanent situation. They had a word for this, which translated imperfectly from English as stubbornness, but which those who had spent time studying them preferred to translate as memory. Specifically, the memory of every time in their long and improbable history that the situation had seemed beyond them and had subsequently proved to be otherwise. It was, the Conclave's sociological division had eventually concluded, the most dangerous cognitive adaptation they had ever catalogued, and the most useful. The first thing Ambassador Kelvoreth noticed about the human was his hands. Not the ship he'd arrived on, a battered third-generation Terran frigate that the Conclave's docking logs had flagged twice for expired gravitational shielding. Not the insignia on his chest, the faded patch of some Earth military branch that no one in the Conclave chamber could identify. Not even his size, which was the first thing most species noticed about humans, that strange, compressed density, like a predator folded into a smaller skin than it deserved. No, it was the hands. Calloused at every joint, a crescent scar running from the left thumb across the palm, the knuckles of the right hand slightly misaligned, healed wrong from an old break. They were the hands of a person who had been in places they shouldn't have survived. The human's name, according to the registration manifest, was Corporal Davin Marsh. His rank was a formality at this point. Earth's military structure had collapsed twice in the last decade, and anyone who'd kept their stripes had kept them more out of habit than hierarchy. He was 29 years old, which the assembled conclave members understood intellectually but struggled to process. To the Velkari, who reached full cognitive maturity at 40, 29 was a larval number. To the MA-Track, who considered anything under 100 years to be adolescent, 29 barely registered at all. To the Sithran, who measured time in stellar cycles and regarded anything that died before its star did as regrettably brief, 29 was almost poignant. He sat in the middle of the chambers holding floor, not a chair. Humans had requested chairs, but no one had thought to provide one, and looked around at 11 representatives of 11 species with the calm, evaluative expression of a man reading a room before he decided whether to trust it. "You want to tell me," he said, after a silence that had stretched long enough to become deliberate, "why I'm here?" Ambassador Kelvoreth leaned forward in the primary chair. She was Velkari, copper-scaled, with the wide lateral eyes of a deep-water predator. She had spent 30 years in diplomatic service and had developed a refined ability to read biological stress signals across species. The human displayed almost none. His heart rate, according to the ambient biosensors, was 54 beats per minute. The baseline for a human male his age at rest was 60 to 100. He was either pathologically calm or he'd trained himself to be, and she wasn't sure which was more unsettling. "You were the sole survivor of the Perdition Gate incident," she said. Something moved behind his eyes, not fear, something quieter and older than fear. 18 months ago, he said. "Yeah. You entered what the Galactic Survey Commission had classified as an anomalous dimensional corridor, a portal of unknown origin located in the Verath expanse. You were part of a 6-person science team tasked with preliminary assessment. 7, he said, 7 people. She paused. The report listed 6. Dr. Sesek got pulled in before we could activate the recording array. The GSC never counted her because she wasn't on the official manifest. He said it without inflection, the way people said things they'd said enough times that the words had been worn smooth. 7 people went in. 1 came back. I want that number accurate. Kelvoreth dipped her head, acknowledging. 7. You entered the corridor. You were the sole survivor. We are convening this assembly because in the 18 months since your return, 17 other teams from 9 member species have attempted to enter the same corridor. A pause settled over the chamber. None of them came back, he said. None of them came back, she confirmed. Davin Marsh looked at the floor between his feet for a long moment. He had a small, flat piece of metal in his left hand. None of them had noticed it until now that he was turning over slowly with his thumb. A habit. Something kept there for the texture of it, not the meaning. So you want to know what's inside, he said. We want to know how you survived. He looked up. And for the first time since he'd sat down, Ambassador Kelvoreth felt the full weight of his attention land on her, and understood, in that animal part of the brain that precedes language and culture and civilization, exactly why the species that had evolved on the 3rd planet of a small yellow star had managed to survive long enough to reach the stars. Those are 2 very different questions, he said. He told it the way he'd told it 4 times before, to the GSC debrief team, to the Earth Defense Committee, to the independent investigator they'd sent 6 months later when the official reports started contradicting each other. And once, late at night in a bar on Callisto Station, to no one in particular, just to hear it out loud and confirm it still made the same amount of terrible sense it always had. The corridor had opened without warning. That was the first thing. The instruments had been reading the anomaly as stable, a slow electromagnetic drift with no mass displacement indicators, and then in the space of 3 seconds it had yawned open like a wound in space and pulled them through before anyone could reach the emergency abort panel. The transit itself lasted less than a second. It felt like falling through cold water in complete darkness, and then they were standing in the grayscape. That was the name Davin had given it in his head, because it didn't have one. The GSC's official classification was Corridor Interior Domain, which was the kind of name that told you a committee had written it in a conference room and never had to live inside it. The grayscape was a dimension of desolate geography, ash-colored plains, a sky the color of old bruising, forests of black, leafless trees that clicked against each other in a wind that felt wrong, that moved at angles wind wasn't supposed to move. The light came from nowhere and went everywhere. There were no shadows. The absence of shadows was one of the first things that told you something fundamental had gone wrong with the physics. Describe the inhabitants, said Rear Admiral Thesson Vore of the MA-Track contingent. The MA-Track were mineral-based, slow-moving, and constitutionally indifferent to biological suffering, which made them excellent analysts. Collectors, we called them, Davin said. The big ones, they move slow, but they don't have to move fast. They have all the time in existence on their side. He paused. They look like they were designed by something that understood biology from the outside, like someone had taken the concept of a living being and built it from memory, missing a few things. Wrong number of joints, eyes in places that should be structural. They dragged these carts. Rickety like old earth wooden carts, heaped with what I initially took for refuse. He stopped. And what were they actually heaped with? Kelvoreth asked. The things they'd already finished collecting, he said. He left that for a moment. The other kind was smaller, pack hunters. They didn't need the carts. What they took, they carried inside them. He ran a hand across the back of his neck, a small gesture, the first one that looked involuntary. Dr. Vasilin was taken 3 hours in, he said. We heard him first, then we found the cart. A long silence in the chamber. There was a structure, he continued. About 4 kilometers from the entry point, something that looked like a gate or a church. The architecture kept shifting when you weren't looking directly at it. Gothic, enormous, above the main entrance there was an inscription. He recited it flatly. "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." "Dante," said the Velcari Jr. attaché, who had studied Earth literature as part of a cultural exchange program. "Dante," Davin confirmed, which told me something important. That the domain was constructed to reference human mythology, Kelvorath said. That the domain was intelligent enough to tailor itself to whoever entered it, or at least to use what it found in the minds of the people who crossed over. He paused. 17 other teams from 9 other species tried to enter after us. None of them came back. You want to know what I think the inscription said to them? No one answered, which was itself an answer. It said whatever they most needed to believe was impossible to survive. The chamber broke for 3 hours. Davin was given quarters, a small utilitarian room near the diplomatic residential block that smelled of recycled air and institutional cleaning fluid, identical in character to every military bunkroom he'd ever slept in. He didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the cot with his boots still on and turned the flat piece of metal over in his hand. It was a rank pin, not his. He'd found it in the grayscape, half buried in ash, 3 days after Dr. Sesek had been pulled in, and he'd carried it ever since because it reminded him that the things you lost in there didn't stop being real just because the place they were lost in was impossible. There was a knock at the door at the 2-hour mark, not the synthesized chime the room system used, an actual knock, knuckle on door frame. He opened it. Standing in the corridor was something he had never encountered before, a Garvak. He knew them only from records. They were classified as Category 4 predatorial sapients, the highest classification the Conclave's Biological Threat Index assigned, reserved for species so fundamentally built for lethal efficiency that their mere presence in shared spaces required special clearance. The Garvak had been a member of the Conclave for 200 years, since the end of the Resource Wars, when they had won so decisively that the winning itself had become awkward, and a peace treaty had seemed easier for everyone. They were tall. This one was approximately 2.5 meters. Exoskeletal plate over a bilateral internal skeleton, deep matte black with a slight iridescent shimmer at the joint points, like oil on dark water. 4 primary limbs, 2 secondary. A head that suggested a face without quite committing to one. And a smell, cold iron and deep space and something old, like stone that had never seen sunlight. This one was wearing a sash, diplomatic rank Davin's memory supplied, senior emissary. They looked at each other. "You are Davin Marsh," the Garvak said. Its voice came from somewhere inside its chest rather than any visible mouth, a deep, layered resonance like 2 sounds at slightly different frequencies. "I am," Davin said. "I watched you in the chamber today." A pause. "You are very small." "I've heard that." "I do not mean it as diminishment. I mean that you are structurally compact in ways my people find difficult to model. Who are your mass are juveniles. They do not carry themselves the way you carry yourself." Davin considered this. "What do you want?" "To speak with you, before the conclave reconvenes. I am Vethkar. My people have a particular interest in the Perdition Gate." The Garvak paused in a way that seemed to require physical effort, like the concept of pausing was something it had to practice. "May I enter?" Davin stepped aside. The Garvak sat on the floor, which lowered its eyeline to his, which Davin suspected was intentional. It told him the thing he hadn't put in any of the official reports. The Ak had lost someone in the grayscape too. "Not in the gate itself," Vethkar said. "There is a secondary corridor, 3 light years from the primary. We found it 11 years before your survey team encountered the first one. We sent a scouting unit of 8, Category 4 clearance, all of them." It paused. "Gone." I'm sorry, Davin said and meant it. The conclave does not know this. It would alter the political geometry of this assembly in ways that would not serve the recovery of the survivors. Davin went very still. You think there are survivors? I think the domain does not simply destroy what it takes. I think it keeps them. Vethkar's secondary limbs shifted, a gesture Davin couldn't read. The carts your collectors pulled. The things they had already collected. My scouting report from the unit's last transmission before the signal failed described the same imagery. A collector pulling a cart, and what was on the cart was still breathing. The room was very quiet for a long moment. You want to go back, Davin said. I want you to lead us back, Vethkar said. Because you are the only being in this conclave who has entered the perdition gate and returned. And because I have spent 11 years studying the records of every entity that entered that corridor, and I have developed a theory about why you specifically survived. What's the theory? The Garvak regarded him with whatever served it as attention. The domain is designed to end hope. That is its primary mechanism of destruction. It reads what you most believe cannot be defeated, and it becomes that thing. It builds itself out of your certainty that survival is impossible. A pause. You are human. Davin said nothing. In 11 years of study, Vethkar continued, I have found no recorded instance of a human being accepting the impossibility of their own survival. Not in your history of warfare, not in your disaster records, not in your medical literature. You are, as a species, constitutionally incapable of believing that the situation is beyond you. Something shifted in its voice, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to respect in the way a glacier might be adjacent to a river. The domain could not finish you, because you would not finish yourself. Davin looked at the piece of metal in his hand. There were 7 of us, he said. 6 of them didn't make it. No, Vethkar said, but none of them were you. The conclave reconvened the following morning with a proposal on the floor that no one had entirely expected. A joint re-entry mission, to be led by the human survivor, accompanied by a small team of volunteer representatives from the conclave member species. The mission objective was not exploration. It was not academic. It was recovery. The debate lasted 4 hours. Ambassador Kelvoreth argued in favor, on grounds that the conclave had a duty of care to those it had sent into hazard. The MA-Track contingent abstained, noting that the probability of successful extraction was, by their calculations, between 3 and 9%, and that those numbers did not justify additional resource expenditure. The Sithran representative spoke for 20 minutes about the metaphysical nature of dimensional imprisonment. Before anyone noticed, it had stopped addressing the motion and was simply philosophizing, and had to be gently redirected. The Garvak contingent voted in favor without comment. In the end, 7 volunteers, a number that felt like something, though Davin was the only one in the room for whom it had a specific weight. He looked at them across the mission briefing table, Vethkar, who needed no introduction. A young Velkari technician named Sareth, who specialized in dimensional physics and seemed to be running on the kind of terrified enthusiasm that sometimes produced brilliance. A MA-Track soldier named Grentash who had volunteered apparently on principle and said almost nothing during introductions. A Sithran medic, Veth, translucent and bioluminescent, whose emotional states were literally visible in the color gradients of its skin. A Thren engineer named Pask, bipedal, 6-fingered, with the nervous system of a species that had evolved in earthquake country and therefore processed danger as acceleration rather than paralysis. And a being none of them had expected. An elderly Keth navigator named Myrashan, who was 340 years old, had 7 missing fingers from a mining accident, and had apparently submitted her volunteer form before the mission was even officially proposed, on the grounds that she had nothing particularly pressing scheduled. Davin looked at each of them for a long moment. The briefing materials the conclave gave you are accurate up to a point, he said. The dimensional corridor is real. The interior domain is real. The entities inside it are real. What the briefing doesn't tell you, because I left it out of every debrief I gave, is that the place is smart. Not intelligent the way you or I are intelligent. Smart the way a trap is smart. It reads what's in your head and it constructs a reality around the worst conclusions you can draw. He looked at them. Every one of you has a worst conclusion. Something you believe, if you push it far enough, cannot end well. This place will find it. It will show it to you. It will give you evidence. And it will wait for you to accept the verdict. Sareth's copper scales had gone slightly pale. And you survived because I refused to stop arguing with the verdict, Davin said. For 6 days. That's all. I didn't have superior training. I didn't have secret knowledge. I didn't have a plan that worked out neatly. I just kept finding reasons why the situation wasn't as final as it looked, and eventually the place ran out of ways to convince me. He paused. What I'm asking you to do inside that domain is simple. When it tells you something is over, when it gives you proof, overwhelming and persuasive, that whatever you're doing cannot work, I need you to find one more thing to try. Just one. That's all. One more thing every time. Grentash's mineral surface made a sound like grinding. And if there is no more thing, then you come up with a thing, Davin said. You make one up if you have to. The point isn't for it to work. The point is to not give the domain what it's waiting for. He looked around the table. It can't file you while you're still moving. A silence. I'm going to tell you what I know about surviving in there, he said. And then I need you to tell me honestly whether you still want to do this. No one left. They went through 2 days later, before the political window closed. The corridor opened the same way it always had, a tearing, a brightness, a cold that wasn't cold but felt like the memory of cold. And then they were in the grayscape, and the sky above them was the color of old bruising, and the trees were clicking in the wrongly angled wind, and the light came from nowhere, as it always had. Davin stood for a moment and just breathed it in. He had spent 18 months convincing himself that the memories were larger than the reality. That time and distance had made it worse than it was. He had been wrong. It was exactly as bad as he remembered. Sareth activated the dimensional stabilizer immediately, a device she had spent 6 months designing specifically for this mission, built on the theory that the corridor could be held open from the inside if you gave it a persistent anchor point. The stabilizer planted itself in the grayscape's ash-pale ground and hummed at a frequency that Davin felt in his back teeth. Green light, in a place with no shadows. It's working, Sareth said, with the barely suppressed astonishment of someone whose math had just proven itself against the universe. For how long? Davin asked. 19 hours, give or take. Then we have 18. He looked at the team. 1 hour buffer, no exceptions. If we're not back at this point in 18 hours, Sareth stays and holds the anchor. Everyone else makes their own calculation. He paused. No heroics on my account. Veth Kar, beside him, made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been something else. In the gray light of the grayscape, the Garvak's iridescent joints caught nothing, and it looked more like a shadow than a being. Northeast, Davin said, orienting by the wrongness of the wind's pull. 3 kilometers. That's where I found the first collector the last time I was here. How do you know the geography persists? Grentash asked. I don't, but the domain uses what's in your head, so I'm going to assume it's using mine, which means it'll look familiar until it decides not to. He started walking. After a moment they followed. The leeches found them first. They came up through the ash like black water, fast and silent, and the only reason Davin saw them before they reached Ulveth was that he'd been watching the ground the way he'd learned to watch it the first time, looking for the slight disturbance in the surface that preceded emergence. He shouted a warning and pulled the Sithran medic back by one translucent arm, and the leech mass surged past, hit the ash, and rose up coiling. 3 meters of boneless, eyeless predator that the grayscape had apparently decided was appropriate for this particular stretch of ground. Grentash moved with an efficiency that was almost beautiful to watch. The MA-track soldier hit the leech thing with a compression weapon that cracked the air and folded it backward, then held it there while Pass came in from the left with a thermal lance and finished it. Total elapsed time, 4 seconds. Davin filed this away. The Garvak had been right about Grentash. But not before one smaller tendril found Sareth's leg and punched through the suit. She went down, more from shock than damage. The tendril had already retracted, but the wound was doing something wrong, not healing wrong, which Davin would have understood, but changing wrong. The flesh around the entry point darkening at a rate that had nothing to do with infection and everything to do with the grayscape's particular biotoxic creativity. Ulveth was there in 2 seconds flat. The Sithran medic's skin shifted to the deep red-orange of intense concentration, and its multiple hands worked with a focused speed that reminded Davin of watching a surgeon. It produced an instrument he didn't recognize, applied something to the wound that made Sareth hiss between her teeth, and then looked up with skin gone to a pale, worried green. "I can stabilize it," it said. "I cannot reverse it without equipment we didn't bring." "Define stable," Davin said. "She can walk, she can work. The progression will slow to approximately 1 millimeter per hour." Ulveth's skin flickered. "She has 31 hours before it reaches critical." Davin looked at Sareth. The young Velkari technician was sitting up, copper scales pale but eyes clear, examining her own leg with the expression of someone conducting a very upsetting science experiment. "I'm fine," she said. "I've been injured before." "Not like this," Davin said. "No," she agreed, "not like this." She looked up. "I'm still fine." He helped her up. They kept moving. 20 minutes in, Myrashan came up beside him. The old Keth navigator matched his pace without effort, which surprised him. She was 340 and moved like someone who had decided long ago that the world would simply have to keep up. Her 3-fingered right hand was at her side, relaxed, the missing 7 fingers a history compressed into absence. "You've been here before," she said. "Not just the grayscape, here, this specific kind of place." "I told you about the first mission in the briefing," Davin said. "I don't mean the grayscape," Myrashan said. "I mean a place where the rules are wrong, where the thing trying to end you is very patient and very certain." She looked sideways at him. "My species has a name for it, what we call the dead-end feeling, the place in the middle of a crisis where all the evidence converges on the same conclusion, and the conclusion is that it doesn't end well." "Yeah," Davin said, "I've been there." "How do you move through it?" He thought about it honestly, because Myrashan had that quality old beings sometimes did, of asking questions they actually wanted answered, not questions they were asking for social reasons. "I think about the last time I thought I was finished," he said, "and then I remember that I wasn't, and then I think about the time before that and the time before that." He paused. "After enough times the feeling starts to feel familiar instead of final, like it's a room I've been in before and gotten out of before, and I know the room is real. I know it's bad, but I also know I've left it before, so I start looking for the door." Myrashan was quiet for a moment. "My species has very long lives," she said. 300 years, 400, some of us longer. When you are young, you think the length of life is the gift. You think you will have time for everything." She lifted her 3-fingered hand and looked at it. "When you are old, you understand the real gift. It is not the time. It is the accumulation of times you thought it was over, and it wasn't. Each one of those becomes a proof, a record of evidence." She put her hand down. "By 340 years, I have a very large archive of evidence that the situation is survivable." Davin looked at her sideways. "That's almost exactly what I said." "Yes," Myrashan said. "I imagine this quality of your species is why you have managed to get to the stars at all. Most species survive to reach space. You appear to have made a weapon of it. The gray trees clicked in the wrongly angled wind. Somewhere to their north, a sound moved across the ash-pale ground that had no biological analog anyone could comfortably identify. Davin watched the tree line and kept walking and did not slow down. The collector found them at the 2-hour mark. They heard it first, that particular sound Davin had never been able to fully describe in any debrief, the creak of wrongly proportioned wheels on ash-packed ground, the sounds of what was on the cart shifting. It came out of the tree line to their east like something that had been waiting there since the dimension began, slow and enormous, and the cart behind it was heaped high. The team went very still. Davin had briefed them on this. Do not run. Running triggers pursuit behavior. Do not make direct eye contact with any of the facial structures that might be eyes. Do not make sounds associated with distress in your species. Stand still, breathe evenly, wait for it to pass. He watched Myra-Shan, the elderly Keth navigator, beside him. Her 3 remaining fingers on her right hand were wrapped around the grip of her sidearm, but she was standing perfectly still, perfectly calm, with the expression of a woman who had been in dangerous places before and had long ago made her peace with the fact that peace was a temporary arrangement. The collector stopped. It turned its impossible head. In every debrief, Davin had struggled to describe the way the collectors looked at you. It wasn't hunger exactly. Hunger implied need, and the collectors didn't need. It was more like assessment, the way an archivist looks at a document before deciding where to file it. It looked at Davin for 11 seconds. He counted. He had learned to count the last time. Counting gave the brain something to do other than recognize the depth of its own terror. Then it moved on. The cart's contents shifted as it passed, and Davin, who was watching the cart with the focused attention of a man looking for something specific, saw it. A shape buried beneath that didn't have the density of the rest. A shape that moved with a slight, involuntary rhythm, still alive, still breathing. He didn't move until the collector was 100 meters away, and the sound of the cart had faded to the baseline wrongness of the grayscape's ambient noise. That cart, Vethkar said very quietly. I know, Davin said. The survivors will be. I know. He started walking, faster now. The structure appeared at the 4-hour mark. It was exactly as he remembered it. Enormous, Gothic in silhouette, with an architecture that kept suggesting a church and then denying it. Too many angles, too much repetition in the wrong places. The kind of building that looked like it had been designed by something that had seen churches but misunderstood their purpose. Above the main gate, in script that was different now, not Latin, or rather not just Latin but shifted into something that seemed to be simultaneously readable in every language present in every mind in the team, the inscription. Abandon all hope, you who enter here. Ulveth's skin went deep purple. Grentash's mineral surface crackled slightly, like stone under pressure. Pask's 6 fingers tightened on the equipment harness. Myra-Shan read it with the expression of someone who had read equally depressing things before. Vethkar said, in that layered resonance, we expected this. We did, Davin said, which is what makes it not quite as scary as it's trying to be. He looked at each of them. This is a threat delivered at the entrance of a place from which nothing returns. We are going to return. So. He shrugged, a small, human gesture that landed in the team like something dropped. The inscription is inaccurate. He pushed the gate open. It was heavy. It resisted. He pushed harder. It opened. Inside was a place built from fear. Not metaphorically, physically, architecturally, spatially constructed from the specific shape of fear that the grayscape had extracted from the minds it processed. The corridors shifted. Rooms appeared that shouldn't have rooms in them. At one point, they descended a staircase for 7 minutes and emerged at a level that should have been deep underground but opened onto the same gray sky. They lost Pask in the 4th corridor. Not to a predator. Not to a collector. To the building itself, which simply produced a wall where a moment before there had been an open passage, and when they pulled the wall apart with their bare hands, Grentash and Vethkar working in tandem, the stone of the Matrak soldier's skin cracking with effort against material that pushed back with physics that weren't quite real. The passage behind it was empty. Davin stood where Pask had been standing and looked at the floor. The ash had been disturbed. The six-fingered boot prints went in and stopped and didn't come back. The collector root, Myrashan said. She was the one who said it because she was the one who could say it without breaking, at 340 years old with 7 missing fingers, having made her peace. If they're being kept somewhere, that's where Pask will be. We follow the cart tracks. We follow the cart tracks, Davin agreed. He had learned something the first time he'd been here that he hadn't included in any debrief, because it was too strange and too personal to reduce to a report. The grayscape didn't just use what was in your mind against you. It also used what you refused to give up. The things you were still holding. The things you would not release. The rank pin in his pocket. The name he still said when he listed the team. 7 people, not 6. The domain could not take what you wouldn't put down. The collector's route led them down. Under the structure, through passages that smelled of ash and something older, into levels that had clearly not been designed for any biology they possessed. The cart tracks in the ash were unmistakable. They followed them for 40 minutes through chambers that Davin didn't look at too carefully, through corridors lined with things he refused to catalog, past sounds he filed away and addressed to no one. Grentash walked beside him for a long stretch without speaking, which is what the Matrak did when they had something to say that hadn't taken its final shape yet. "You've been here before," the Matrak soldier said eventually. "Yeah. And you came back." "Yeah. Why?" Davin considered the question. It was, in the context of the grayscape, more complicated than it looked. "Because the people I came in with didn't," he said, "and I'm still not finished with that fact." Grentash processed this with the mineral patience of its kind. "That's not a reason," it said. "That's a wound." "Yes," Davin said, "that's what I said." The Matrak soldier was quiet for a moment longer. Then, "My people believe wounds are load-bearing structures. We do not remove them, we build on them." "I know a few humans who'd agree with that," Davin said. The holding chamber was below everything. It was vast, spherical, and lit by the same sourceless gray light that pervaded the whole domain, but denser here, like the light had accumulated. And arranged throughout the space, in structures that were somewhere between cages and capsules and something with no terrestrial equivalent, were the survivors. Not just the survivors from the reentry missions, from further back than that. From the beginning of whatever the grayscape was, from whatever moment the corridor had first opened and the first beings had stumbled through and been collected. Hundreds of them. Thousands, possibly. Davin stood at the entrance and looked at the scope of it and felt something move through him that was beyond grief and beyond rage, and settled into something cold and clear and functional. Vethkar was beside him, and for the first time in the 2 days he'd known the Garvak, he heard something in its layered voice that might have been fracture. "There," it said. At the far end of the chamber, 8 forms in Garvak silhouette. Category 4. Iridescent joints gone dark with 11 years of stillness but still recognizable. Still, against all physical logic, breathing. "They're alive," Vethkar said, and it was not a question and it was not quite a statement. It was something between the two, the sound of a certainty that had spent 11 years being a hope. "They're alive," Davin confirmed. Sareth was already moving, pulling the dimensional anchor relay from her pack, the secondary device, the one that could interface with the primary stabilizer back at the entry point and extend a tether into the chamber's deepest level. Her hands were steady. Her leg, wrapped and darkening, did not slow her. She planted the relay and activated it, and the green light cut across the gray like a contradiction. 13 hours left on the primary, she said. 12 hours effective operational window. Do we have enough time to? We'll make it enough time, Davin said. Sareth counted them while she worked on the relay. Her voice was low, ticking off the numbers with the automatic focus of a scientist turning distress into data, because it was the only tool she had left for managing it. 32 in the upper tier, she said. At minimum, some of the structures are stacked. 11 in the middle level. I can't see the lower tier from here. Davin was already moving toward the nearest holding structure. Up close, it was worse. Not because of what he could see, but because of what he recognized. The shape of the structures, if he looked at them straight, they were alien and unknowable. If he looked at them sideways, they resolved into something that pulled at memory. The shape of a hospital bed, a prison cell, a sensory deprivation chamber, the specific dimensions of a space designed to fit one body and remove everything else. The domain had built its prison out of forms that the imprisoned would instinctively understand as confinement. It was thorough. He gave it that. A Velkari was in the nearest one. Young, Davin couldn't reliably gauge alien ages, but the scales were unmarked. No environmental weathering on the lateral eyes. Possibly the second mission, which had gone in 8 months ago. Possibly the first Velkari team that had entered a year before that. The being looked at him with the dull-eyed recognition of someone who had been told by every sensory input they possessed, for months, that no one was coming. Hi, Davin said. He crouched to put himself at eye level. The Velkari said nothing. My name is Davin. I'm with Ambassador Kelvorath's office. I know you've been here a while. I know this place has been very persuasive about the situation being permanent. He put his hand flat on the wall of the structure, not on the Velkari, just present, visible, warm-blooded, and real. The situation is not permanent. We're leaving, all of us. But I need you to help me. I need you to want to leave because this structure uses whatever you believe. If you believe you're stuck, it keeps you stuck. Can you try to believe, just for right now, that there's a way out? The Velkari looked at him for a long moment. Then it reached out and put its hand on the wall next to his. The structure shifted, not dramatically, not a dramatic unlocking, no cinematic collapse, just a subtle, almost reluctant yielding, like a knot going slack when the tension on one end is released. Enough. There you go, Davin said. Come on. It took 6 hours to work through the mechanisms of the holding structures. They were not locked in any conventional sense. The grayscape didn't use locks. It used the assumption of helplessness, the belief of the prisoner that release was impossible. Which meant that the ones who were hardest to get out were the ones who had been there longest, who had had their certainty ground down to nothing over years or decades. Davin went to the Garvek unit first. 11 years was a long time. He crouched in front of Veth Kar's missing scouts and looked at them one by one. 8 faces that he couldn't read, in the way he couldn't read any Garvek face, but biology spoke across that gap. The hunch of defeat, the stillness of bodies that had stopped expecting contact from outside. The iridescent shimmer at their joints had gone matte. Their secondary limbs were folded in, close to the body, the posture that Veth Kar had told him, in the shuttle briefing on the way to the corridor, was how his species held themselves when they believed themselves to be at an end. 11 years. Davin thought about that number. He had spent 18 months trying to convince himself that 6 days in the grayscape were something he could set down, carry lightly, tuck away into the past tense file in his brain. He had not succeeded. He did not want to think about 11 years. He let himself not think about it for the space of one breath, and then he thought about it anyway, because these 8 beings had lived it, and the least he could do was look at it directly. He put a hand on the arm of the nearest. The plates were cold. My name is Davin Marsh, he said. I'm human, I'm here with Veth Kar, we're getting you out. The Garvek didn't respond. I know you've been here a long time, he said. I know the place has been telling you nobody's coming. I know what that does to a person. I know it because I've been in this place and I've felt it trying to do it to me. He kept his hand on its arm. The place is wrong. I need you to believe that for the next 12 hours. I need you to hold on to that. Can you do that for me?" The Garvak's secondary limbs shifted, slowly, like something remembering how to move, like a door long closed on hinges stiff from disuse, finding it still could. Vethkar was beside Davin in an instant, crouching, speaking in its own language, the layered resonance of it filling the chamber, something in it that Davin didn't need a translation for. The sound of kinship, of recognition, of someone saying, "I kept looking. I didn't stop looking." Something in the 8 dark forms shifted, not quickly, not dramatically, like stone cracking, like something letting light in through the crack. They found Pask in the chamber's lower tier, 3 hours into the extraction. The Thren engineer was alive, disoriented, with the specific look of someone who had spent a concentrated period believing the worst possible outcome to be inevitable, and now couldn't quite process that the math had changed. Pask looked at Davin for a long moment, and then said, in its native language, something that Sareth's translation unit rendered as, "I was afraid I was never going to see a face I recognized again." "Yeah," Davin said, "I know exactly what that's like." They found others too. Velkari from the 2nd mission, M.A. Track from the 5th, 2 beings from species Davin didn't recognize, who looked at him with the exhausted wariness of the long imprisoned, and said nothing at first but didn't move away from him either. Myrashan was the one who stayed with them, speaking in the calm, matter-of-fact tones of a woman who had 340 years of practice sitting with other beings in difficult circumstances. Her 3-fingered hand rested on a shoulder. Her voice was very steady. Grentash said nothing. The M.A. Track soldier worked. Ulveth treated 47 beings in 6 hours with the focused, bioluminescent efficiency of a medic, who understood that the calculation of triage was not abandonment, but love expressed in arithmetic. Sareth, leg darkening, mouth tight, monitored the relay. At the 11-hour mark she said, 2 hours, we have to move now. The collectors came, as they were moving the last of them toward the passage. 3 of them, emerging from the upper levels, moving with that same deliberate weight that had nothing to do with urgency, because urgency implied competition, and the collectors had never competed against anything that had contested them. Until now. Vethkar moved first. The Garvak senior emissary, for the first time in the 2 days Davin had known them, removed the diplomatic sash. And what moved through the chamber toward the collectors was not an ambassador, but a Category 4 predatorial sapient in full expression of its biology, and the space between them was not much. The 8 recovered Garvak scouts, thin and weakened from 11 years of captivity, rose. Grentash was already there. The collector nearest the passage stopped. Its impossible head turned, and for the first time, Davin was certain of it, something in its assessment shifted. The archivist expression changed, something in it recalibrated. Davin stood between the collectors and the passage, and held his ground. He was the smallest thing in the chamber. He was aware of this in an abstract way, the way you're aware of your height when standing next to something taller. It was a fact, not a verdict. The collector's attention moved to him and he met it. He counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. "Go," he said without turning around. "Move. Everyone through the passage now. Sareth, get the relay. Myrashan, take point. Move." He heard them moving. He kept his eyes on the collector. The thing about the grayscape, the thing he had worked out alone over 6 days the first time, watching it try and fail to take him, was that it operated on a simple mechanism. It offered you the conclusion. It gave you the proof, overwhelming and irrefutable, that the situation was beyond surviving, and then it waited for you to accept it. Everything after that was administrative. The problem was that Davin had grown up in a species that had spent 200,000 years refusing to accept conclusions. "You can't have them," he said to the collector. "They're mine, we're leaving." The collector looked at him. He looked back. Vethkar's hand landed on his shoulder from behind. "The passage is clear," the Garvek said. "Everyone is through." "Good," Davin said, still looking at the collector. "Let's go." They went. The corridor closed 12 minutes after they cleared the entry point. Davin stood on the right side of physics and watched the tear in space seal itself with that same sound, a tearing, a brightness. And then it was gone, and the Verath expanse was just a stretch of empty space, with a slightly irregular electromagnetic signature that the GSC had already marked as under indefinite review. He counted the people around him. 44. 44 people who had been in the grayscape and were now out of it. 44 people breathing air that came from outside that place. He was aware that he was shaking slightly. Not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the specific physiological response of a body that had been in sustained high-stress conditions for 14 hours and was now trying to convince its nervous system that the emergency was over. He breathed through it. Sareth was sitting on the hull of their shuttle, leg up. Ulveth crouched over it with equipment and that focused red-orange color. The wound would heal. Ulveth had been clear about that. It would heal and leave a scar that ran from mid-calf to knee, and the Velkari technician had already announced her intention to tell people it was from something more dramatic than a leech analog in a dimensional hell domain, and Davin had told her she'd earned whatever story she wanted to tell. Myrashan was sitting on a cargo crate eating something from a ration pack, with the equanimity of someone who had navigated the worst of what the galaxy had and found it, on balance, survivable. 7 missing fingers, 2 additional experiences of things that should have ended her. Still here. Davin looked at the space where the corridor had been and felt the familiar weight settle back into its familiar place. The piece of metal was in his hand. Vethkar came and stood beside him. 33 of the 44 survivors are from missions sent after yours, the Garvek said. 11 from before. My scouts are among the oldest. I saw, Davin said. The Conclave will want a full debriefing. I know. They will also, Vethkar said, with the measured weight of someone selecting words with care, want to understand the full scope of what you did. I didn't do anything, Davin said. I just held the door while other people walked through it. Vethkar was quiet for a moment. That is not how my species will tell this story, it said. Davin looked up at the stars. From here you could see 6,000 or 7,000 of them with the naked eye, each one a sun, most of them with worlds around them, all of it unimaginably enormous and indifferent and alive with things that were trying to survive, the way things did, against whatever the universe put in front of them. The Conclave will classify you, Vethkar said. They do this with things they cannot otherwise process. They will give you a designation, category something. They will file what you did under the heading of human exceptionalism and write a report that explains it in terms that make the Conclave feel less like it missed something obvious. Let them, Davin said. I don't need a designation. No, Vethkar said. You need a word count. Davin looked at it. My species has a tradition, Vethkar said. When someone returns our dead to us, we do not offer ceremony because ceremony is for the living and the living can receive it at any time. We offer instead the specific thing that was lost. We name what was missing. We say the name of the one who was absent for as long as they were absent so that the silence is filled, so that the air knows it was wrong to have been quiet. A pause. I do not know if humans have an equivalent. We have something close, Davin said. What do you call it? He thought about it. We call it not letting anyone get forgotten. Vethkar was still for a long moment. In the gray light of the shuttle bay, its iridescent joints caught the overhead fluorescence and scattered it in small cold points, like stars very close. Tell it however you want, he said. Just get the number right. Vethkar tilted its head, the number. Davin opened his hand and looked at the rank pin. 7 people went into the grayscape the first time. For 18 months the official count said 6. He closed his fingers around it. I came back and went in again and brought out 44. That's the number that matters. That's the one I want in the record. A long pause. You went back, Vethkar said, for 7 people. I went back because I didn't finish, Davin said. There's a difference. And in the quiet of the shuttle bay, surrounded by 44 survivors breathing the same recycled air and blinking at the same ordinary light that came from a source they could see, Davin Marsh stood with the galaxy's most effective predator and did the thing that his species had always done best. He stayed in the place where things had been hardest until he was finished. The collector had looked at him and seen something it couldn't file, something it had never encountered before in all its infinite archiving of the lost. A being that would not conclude. Vethkar's secondary limbs shifted, and the sound it made then, low, resonant, almost subvocal, was not a sound it made in diplomatic contexts, not a sound recorded in any conclave transcript. It was the sound the Garvak made for their own dead when the body was brought home, the sound of a debt acknowledged, the sound of something restored to where it belonged. Davin didn't know what it meant, but it felt like a name. He tucked the rank pin back in his pocket beside his own, walked back toward the shuttle. Behind him, 44 survivors were learning to breathe again, one at a time, in whatever rhythm their biology required. The grayscape had not finished any of them. It had come close with some. It had tried with all. But it had made one mistake that it would not get to correct. It had let a human in, and humans had a way of not leaving things behind them the way the grayscape had counted on. Davin sat on the hull of the shuttle for a long time after Vethkar left him there. The stars were out. They were always out in deep space, indifferent and continuous, and completely unhelpful in the way that very large things are unhelpful, present, available, not particularly interested in the small, complicated business of being alive. He had a piece of metal in his hand. He had carried it for 18 months. He thought about Dr. Sesek, who had been first through the corridor on that original mission, who had been a xenobiologist specializing in atmospheric chemistry, who had brought 3 separate kinds of hot sauce in her field kit because she had opinions about institutional catering, who had been 42 years old and had laughed at things that most people found merely slightly amusing, the full laugh of someone who had decided that the world owed you joy and you owed it back. Sesek, who had been pulled in before the recording array activated and therefore didn't exist, officially, in the mission manifest. He thought about the other 5. Ward, who had been afraid of the dark since childhood and had become a xenosurveyor anyway, which Davin had always thought was one of the braver things a person could do with a fear. Go straight at it until it was just a fact. Lucia, who had been the youngest of the team and had spent the first 2 days in the grayscape cataloging its biological structures with methodical focus, recording everything, as if documentation were itself a form of resistance. Peter, who had been the person who kept everyone's morale functional not through speeches, but through small, consistent acts of normalcy. Here, eat something. It's still warm. Trish, who had been a navigator by training and an empiricist by temperament, who had looked at the grayscape and said, all right then, let's figure out what this place actually is, and had begun taking notes and had been the last of them besides Davin. Giles, who had been funny in the quiet, dry way that soldiers develop to stay sane, and who had told a story about his grandmother while they hid from a collector that Davin could still recite word for word in his sleep. He carried them in the weight of that piece of metal. He always had. He opened his hand and looked at the rank pin again. Sareth appeared beside him, moving carefully on her wrapped leg, carrying 2 ration packs. She sat beside him without invitation, which he had noticed was something the younger species tended to do with humans. They picked up the behavior early, reading it correctly as tolerance rather than preference for solitude. She handed him one of the packs without comment. He took it. 44, she said after a moment. 44, he agreed. The conclave analysts are going to say it's impossible, she said. They're going to write reports. They're going to model the probability distribution retroactively and find ways to explain it that don't require accepting that one human just went back into the deadliest dimensional domain on record and walked out with 44 people behind him. Let them write the reports, Davin said. The 44 people are still out. Sareth's scales had returned to their normal color. She ate a piece of her ration pack and looked at the stars with the expression of someone doing the math on something much larger than the immediate situation. You know what the Grayscape underestimated, she said, not as a question. What? Time. She turned to look at him. Every other species that entered that domain, the domain assessed them correctly. It found their limit. It found the point at which they would accept that the situation was beyond them. It found the precise psychological boundary of their hope. She paused. But with you, with your species, the domain's model was based on the assumption that hope has a hard edge, a limit. A point of structural failure. She gestured at the closed corridor with one copper hand. It doesn't understand that for humans, the hope isn't a quantity that depletes. It's a habit. You don't run out of it. You just find new reasons for it because you've been finding new reasons for things since before you had language. It's older than your civilization. It's older than your species' concept of the future. She looked back at the stars. The domain built a trap for beings that give up. It never encountered a being that hadn't. Davin was quiet for a while. I got lucky, he said finally. Sareth looked at him with the expression of a scientist being offered an explanation she found inadequate. Sure, she said, you can call it that. He put the rank pin back in his pocket. Every last one of them was going home.